this is just the beginning.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our virtual event on the post-pandemic future of classrooms. Thank you to our audiences who are joining us on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Axios.com. And thank you to our sponsor, Facebook, for partnering with us to make this event possible. So education has been the same for so many decades, and the pandemic shook it up just like it shook up a lot of other industries. Now we're at this place where new technologies could really revolutionize the way we teach kids, but we also risk leaving under-resourced students behind. With that, I want to welcome our first guest, Representative Chrissy Houlahan from the great state of Pennsylvania, who's here to chat through some of these issues and solutions from her perspective as a policymaker, a technologist, and a former educator herself. Welcome, Representative Houlahan. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Erica, for having me.
So I just want to start by framing up our discussion here. The U.S. economy, economists say, could take a 14 to 28 trillion blow because of coronavirus-induced learning loss. And McKinsey has recently reported that American students from kindergarten to fifth grade have missed out on 20% of the reading and 33% of the math skills they would have gotten in normal times. And of course, as you know, there's inequity baked in here. If you look just at students of color, those numbers go up to 23% and 41% for reading and math, respectively. How do you think about this kind of, future-defining, generation-defining issue of learning loss?
Once again, thanks for having me, Erica. And I'm very interested in the data, the statistics that you just gave. And I actually, being an engineer myself, would love to see how that was arrived upon, because I feel as though that's a generous estimation of the loss that we've just experienced over the last year and a half. Meaning I think we're well underestimating what the impacts will be on our economy and our communities and also in the globe. I think one of the things that I was always struck by as an educator was in communities of color primarily, for every year of education, 9 or 10 months of being in a classroom, most of those kids were able to gain about 6 months of learning literacy specifically. And then they would lose as much as 3 months during the summer. And so this was pre-pandemic. That we were really struggling with issues of equity in terms of literacy, numeracy, those kinds of skills that you need to be a functioning member of our society. And so then you add and layer on top of it the pandemic that has brought us and the world to its knees in terms of how we make sure that we continue to educate all ages of people and bring them into this economy.
So I want to zoom in a little bit. What are you seeing on the ground in your own home state? What are the pain points and what are maybe some solutions you're already seeing?
So this was a difficult year for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We were sort of right in the crosshairs of it and only have recently come out of it. We started on a shutdown in the March timeframe and only within the last several weeks have gone to being able to not have masks. We were really bearing the brunt of it because of where we sit physically, right between New York and Washington, D.C. and kind of the gateway to the Midwest as well. So we had a lot of schools that were shut down. We had, of course, a lot of workplaces that were shut down. We struggled with issues of access to broadband. And we struggled with trying to figure out how to make really good and smart decisions at a very localized level in terms of making sure that schools were safe, that kids were safe, that teachers were safe, and that we were all safe. So we are starting to see in different places, different ways of reopening. I believe that in the fall, this area, my area, and the Commonwealth in general will be open for business in terms of education again in a pretty normal setting. But thankfully, we've got a lot of resources heading our way from the federal and state level to try and make sure that happens and happens safely.
And I hear a lot of folks in government talk about learning loss on U.S. soil, but you've kind of broadened it and are talking about global learning loss. Why should Americans and American policymakers specifically care about what's going on in the rest of the world as it relates to learning loss?
And that's an excellent question. And I'm so glad that you asked it. I'm really fortunate that I serve on the Foreign Affairs Committee as well as the Armed Services Committee. And those two things are very much attached. Making sure that we are aware of what happens in the rest of the world as it relates to us is really critical. And specifically on an issue like learning loss, if you have a whole part of the world that has lost significant ground and is significantly disadvantaged, as I believe will be the case, then you have destabilization. You have economies that are unsettled. You add on top of that what we already know is happening from a global health perspective in terms of global warming, and you're going to have a destabilized countries. And so understanding how that learning loss has affected not just us in our communities and Commonwealth and country, but also across the globe is really important. And that's why I put forward a piece of legislation that's bipartisan, which means, of course, both parties, and also bicameral, which means both House and Senate, to assess what that learning loss has been around the world. And indeed, I'll have the opportunity to talk to Samantha Power about this as well during an HVAC hearing, foreign affairs hearing.
And I mean, a leader like you right now is basically just thinking about the rebuilding period. You know, the how we get our kids in the country and around the world caught up. But there are some interesting things that have come out of the shakeup. You know, education has long been a very slow to change industry, and the pandemic has pushed a lot of educators and administrators to think a little bit outside the box. Do you see any of these silver linings coming out? Do you see any ways in which virtual or technology could be a part of the classroom of the future moving forward?
100%. I mean, you have to look only to a couple of weeks ago in my own community, in my own district. We were able to do a virtual live link with the space station. We were able to collect questions from our kids of all ages, including community college ages. Their questions for an astronaut who was literally at the time up in space, to be able to ask those questions. And I don't think we would have had that ability across so many different educational venues a year and a half ago. Our educators have had to be agile. Our administrators have had to be agile. Our parents have had to be agile. And I think as a consequence, we're learning a great deal. I'm hoping that we'll be able to take some of this good that we've learned, and unfortunately in a very bad time, and innovate in education.
So you're right that there's so much good here, but one of the great parts of the physical classroom has been, for a lot of kids, when you come and sit at that desk, it's a great equalizer. But when you go home and you're trying to access things via laptops or broadband, there can be a lot of inequities. How do we make sure that access to tech is more equal across our states and cities?
I agree that that's an issue and a real issue of equity. And I also agree that there really is nothing that replaces in-person education, not just because of the contact that a teacher has with his or her student, but also because of the interaction that a child has with his or her peers as well. And it's a real social safety net too, to check in on a child's mental health and progress and his or her safety in their home. And so I really don't think in the immediate future we should see a world where everything is virtual and everybody is on their screen. But I do think we need to see a world where, should we be unfortunate in a position where another shock to our system like a pandemic happens, that we do have access to technologies equitably. And that means broadband access for everyone. And that means broadband access for the kids in the communities like I taught in North Philadelphia, but also access for the kids in communities in rural Pennsylvania, which is a lot of my community as well. People don't really know that the state of Pennsylvania is actually Appalachian. A lot of the Appalachian Mountains are in our area. And so there are real issues of inequity, not just in the urban parts of my community, but also in the rural parts too. And that's hopefully what we'll be able to accomplish with some of the infrastructure packages that we're pushing forward.
And I want to get to a big part of your work, which is you're one of the founders of and the chair of the Women in STEM Caucus. And looking at a stat here from the Census Bureau, in 1970, American women made up 38% of all US workers and 8% of STEM workers. By 2019, the STEM proportion had increased to 27%, and women made up 48% of all workers. So a lot of incredible progress there, but still not quite at parity. What can be done to get more girls into these disciplines? And you're an engineer yourself.
Sure. And I think we all need to be focused on this. And this is, again, not an issue of, how girls and women should be treated as much as it is an issue of how we can harness the power of all of us in this economy. We are 51% of the population, women are, and we have enormous demands on our economy for STEM and STEAM talented people. And we shouldn't leave 51% of our population behind. And I'm not even speaking, which I ought to be as well, of communities of color and other underserved communities that we haven't even put into this data. We have a ton of progress to make still. Still right now, 52% of women who go to college, the women who go to college are 52% of the whole. So we have more women than men going to college. but only about 16% of the women who go to college are getting engineering or tech degrees at this point in time. So we still have a huge amount of work to go, which is why things like STEM and STEAM caucuses in the Congress are important. And it's kind of tragic that in 2019, that was the first time that we ever had such an organization. And now we have a bipartisan group of 30 or so different members, by both Democrats and Republicans, who are thinking really hard of how we can prime the pump and get more women in all underserved communities involved in the tech talent pool. It's essential, not just for the individual, but for the success of our economy and our competitiveness globally as well.
And with that, thank you so much, Representative, for your time. This was super illuminating, and thanks for joining us.
Of course, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks, Erica.
And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Mia Vallo for a view from the top segment.
Thank you, Erica. I'm Mia Vallo from Axios, and I'd like to introduce Dr. Adam Seldo, Director of Community Product Education Partnerships at Facebook. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you, Mia.
Adam, let's dive right in. What type of work has your team been doing to support educators during the pandemic?
Well, educators were and still are in many ways deeply affected by the pandemic. I mean, imagine spending the bulk of your career teaching in a traditional classroom, or maybe even using blended learning, face-to-face mixed with online learning instruction. And then all of a sudden attempting to do this from your living room with 30 kids in the screen all the time, and maybe even your own kids next to you vying for attention. It's challenging then, and it's an immediate reality for educators across the globe. And in these challenging times, we need our community. We need resources, and in some cases, a whole new set of tools. And we have to remember always that we need to put self-care first to make it through these challenging times. So to this end, Facebook has created the Educator Hub, which is available at education.facebook.com. And some examples of resources we have on the Hub are anti-racism assets from key partners designed to drive towards racial equity and justice with your students, as well as our own anti-racism resources from Instagram. But resources don't just mean content. They also mean addressing bigger issues like food insecurity, student mental health, and finding reliable internet access. And we have all of that on the Educator Hub. And as I mentioned earlier, community is important and particularly interesting to me because there's a group for just about everything and everyone on Facebook.
And can you share an example of one of these groups that you find particularly interesting?
Sure. One such group is called Grown and Flown, and it's designed for educators and parents for young adults ages 15 to 25. And it's a place where you can discuss all aspects of parenting teens, which is relevant to me, college kids, and young adults. And with thousands and thousands of members, it's a place where you're almost certain to connect with people experiencing the same challenges you may be experiencing during the pandemic. On the Educator Hub, we recommend a number of high-value groups where hopefully you can find your people. And again, the Educator Hub with these resources is located at education.facebook.com.
I'm sure the educators appreciate the work that you're doing. Can you also tell us how is Facebook contributing to the next generation of digital creators?
I may be dating myself a bit here, but I remember when I first witnessed student digital creativity in my classroom. I was teaching math in Boston Public Schools before smartphones, and one of my students was customizing their MySpace profile layout for another student. With a few HTML commands, the student created a fully customized experience for her friend, and she turned it into what I consider to be a small business by charging her friends either candy or money to do their layouts. And pretty soon, the whole class had these layouts. And if you fast forward to today, Facebook is celebrating these entrepreneurial creators, and we're helping others to become builders as well. We've launched a number of courses and certifications in areas like digital marketing, community management, and instruction even on creating your first augmented reality effects with Spark AR Studio, which is a product that helps people create virtual effects like masks, a virtual cap and gown for graduation, or even like the donkey head mascot of my college football team. These informal learning opportunities give creators the tools and instruction they need to get jobs, to help local businesses in their communities grow, and even to monetize their own creations.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Finally, what trends do you see emerging in education?
Well, the pandemic opened up people's eyes to the wonderful things already happening in education. Certainly, informal education and skill-based certifications are an important way for learners to stay engaged and develop new skills with relatively little overhead when compared to the more structured degree programs. But what's really exciting to me in the pandemic is that it put a premium on presence, feeling connected to your friends, coworkers, classmates, and even your families. And the closest technology we have to being in the same space with someone when we're not actually there is virtual reality. Besides feeling present, you can be anyone or even anything you want to be and truly feel in the moment, even in impossible scenarios like floating in space. You can imagine that these virtual scenarios can help learners engage content and each other in really meaningful ways. Like a great example is in medical training, where doctors and nurses build muscle memory for common medical procedures through virtual reality. And then something that I see evolving and particularly interesting to the field of education is empathy building in virtual reality. A great example of this is a hotel chain, Hilton, worked with a learning developer called SweetRush to create a VR training program for their employees using 3D computer graphics and 360 video to simulate tasks performed by room service, housekeeping, and their front desk employees. And you can imagine these employees being placed into these virtual scenarios and having to work with customers in the normal way you would in an extremely low risk environment. And so that's just an incredible and interesting way that we're using virtual reality to build empathy. And of course, augmented reality is incredibly accessible through your phone via the Facebook or Instagram camera, whether it's a mask like I described earlier, or a world AR effect, which could bring your textbook to life. Augmented reality is emerging as a way to add important digital context to the real world.
It's great to hear all of the important work that you and your team are doing at Facebook for the education community. Adam, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights.
Thank you, Mia.
Now back to my colleague, Erica Pandy.
Thank you, Mia. And I'm very pleased to welcome our final guest, who is the CEO and founder of Khan Academy, Sal Khan, who's joining me from California today. Thank you for being here, Sal.
Great to be here, Erica.
So Khan Academy has been popular well before the pandemic. I mean, I used it for homework help. As you know, all over the world is a virtual resource for math, for science, and beyond. How has the pandemic, though, changed what used to be kind of the ultimate homework help and made it something bigger?
Well, even pre-pandemic, as you mentioned, a lot of students know Khan Academy for the place where they went and where they were having trouble understanding photosynthesis or factoring polynomials before an exam. But we've always had a lot of teachers use it. Even pre-pandemic, 200-something thousand teachers were using it. We've always had teacher tools. But the pandemic, as you can imagine, with physical schools closures, accelerated everything. We saw our traffic increase or be 3x of what normally is. On normal times, we have about 30 million learning minutes. We saw that increase to about 75, 80, 85 million learning minutes. We saw 12 billion learning minutes on the platform last year. As you can imagine, a good bit of that was extra learning minutes because people needed something where it's accessible at home, it's standards aligned, it works with classrooms, it works with teachers, it covers multiple subjects and grades. There's 50 research studies. We're not for profit. Everything we do, it's offered to the world. It's philanthropically funded, and so it's trusted. So that's been the big headline. But on top of that, it's really accelerated the conversation around the digital divide. Obviously, Khan Academy cannot do the work that it does without people having suitable internet access. And over the last 10 years, we saw a lot of progress in classroom setting of closing the digital divide. But then the pandemic put a big spotlight on the at-home setting. And so it's been unfortunate because I think it did exacerbate inequality or inequity during the pandemic. But the silver lining is more energy than ever. And so we're trying to really work with folks on things like, they're calling it the homework gap now, which is really this notion, which we even saw pre-pandemic, that if even one student doesn't have access at home in a classroom, the teacher really can't lean on that online resource for homework, an online resource like Khan Academy. And so that type of language and that type of focus, we're seeing more energy than ever. And we're just trying to help those things. We're accelerating content. We're accelerating ways for teachers and parents during the pandemic to keep kids learning. And then as we get out of the pandemic, hopefully really scalable and easy ways to help students finish their unfinished learning or learning that might have atrophied or their gaps, whatever you want to call it.
So I want to get to the inequity piece of this, the digital divide piece of this right after this. But, just frankly asking you, we as office workers have kind of accepted that hybrid work is going to be the future. Is hybrid education going to be the future too?
I think the reality is that hybrid education has actually been the present in the past as well. That the students and learners who've done well are the ones that, yes, they go to a physical school setting, but then they're able to find other resources they need to make sure that they don't fall behind. Middle class, affluent families have always been able to get their kids enriching summer programs and after school programs, get them tutors. And so there's always been a hybrid between many, many, many resources. What's interesting about the world where we can create Khan Academies is that the marginal cost of delivery to a new student is close to zero. So we can make these things much more accessible. So it's not hybrid for just the sake of technology. It's hybrid to really allow all students to access what historically only affluent or at least middle income families might have been able to access. So I think as we go forward, some of these principles that we've always believed in, that learning should not be bound by time or space, that wherever you are in space or in your life cycle, you need to, if you want to learn something, there's ways for you to pull it. I think the physical environment is always going to be central. I've said this many times. If I had to pick for my own children or anyone else's children between an amazing in-person experience with amazing teachers versus the fanciest technology, I would pick the in-person every time. But the best is when you can leverage the best of both worlds. Let's see where technology can be valuable, and not just for technology's sake, but in service to what pedagogical goals? Can we give access to certain coursework that a classroom might not have? Can we provide new ways of explaining things, practice with immediate feedback? Can we personalize to the needs of students? One teacher, 30 kids, very hard to meet all of those kids individually unless you can replicate the teacher. This is where we think Khan Academy can be really useful. And then another effort I started called Schoolhouse.world during the pandemic, another not-for-profit for free tutoring. Once again, these are things, it's not an either or proposition. These are ways that in conjunction we can surround the student with learning, but make sure that they're the center of it.
So, there are so many incredible resources online, yours and many others that came after. But, the FCC, as you've said this, estimates 21 million Americans don't have access to high-speed broadband. And then the gap is larger in rural communities, on tribal lands, and for communities of color. So how do we try to chip away at this access gap, as you noted at before?
We've seen heroic efforts during the pandemic, and it really shows how fast we can move when we have the motivation, where school districts in partnership with telecommunications companies, your AT&Ts, your Comcasts of the world, were able to distribute in many cities hundreds of thousands of devices, support them, and get either free or, and actually during the pandemic, in many cases, the telecom companies gave free internet access. So we know this is doable. The other really solid thing is the last wave of stimulus had on the order, I think it was $8 or $9 billion to close the digital divide, which is going to make a big difference. And now there's legislation that could extend that that same order of magnitude for the next 4 or 5 years. And if we're able to do that, that can substantially close the digital divide. It'll help us put the infrastructure so that we can get to some of those rural areas. It can hopefully lower the overall cost. It can get us computers and devices in libraries and after school programs so that even if you don't have suitable access at home, there's some place outside of the classroom. Once again, that would help close what's being called the homework gap, because more and more teachers are realizing it's really valuable to lean on these online tools. But if there's even 10% of your class that does not have access in a library or at home or somehow, you really can't lean on it for the whole class.
We actually got some really awesome Axios reader questions for you too. And one is really relevant here that I want to get to. One of the big issues teachers reported was keeping students engaged in virtual settings. A reader from Los Angeles wants to know, what have you learned with Khan Academy that can, lessons that you can give to teachers on maintaining that engagement in a virtual setting?
Yeah, it's fascinating. We've been close to many educators, and I'm on the board of a school as well, so I had some direct experience there. And what we were hearing from teachers as we went into the pandemic is, wow, we don't know if these kids are paying attention. They can go to other screens. If I just lecture at them, they'll start zoning out. And the reality is this was always the case. Even in a physical classroom, we've always advocated that lecture is not the best way to engage students. Yes, they're physically there, but we don't know if they're mentally there. The best classrooms are the ones where there's maximal human-to-human interaction, whether it's a Socratic dialogue, you're doing a game, you're doing a simulation, you're doing peer-based tutoring. And when you go on video conference, that becomes that much more important. So the educators we've seen that have successfully done this are the ones that they're not lecturing. They might do a little explanation for 2 or 3 minutes, but most of the time is prompting the kids with questions, pulling them out of the screen, cold calling them on them, putting them into breakout sessions, which is actually easier to do in the virtual realm than it is in the physical realm. And what I think is really cool is now that a lot of teachers have gotten used to this during the pandemic, they're going to bring that back to when everyone gets in person. And so you're going to have the best of both worlds. You'll share the room, you'll breathe the same air, you'll able to give each other a hug, but you'll also say, hey, why don't we use a breakout now? Why don't we do tutoring of each other now? Let me call on you and let's solve a problem together, as opposed for me just to lecture at you.
And then I want to get to another question, which I think is a super interesting one from a reader in DC. Will remote learning fundamentally change the workforce of the future?
I think so. Well, I think it's the other way around. The workforce of the future is going to change, regardless of whether there's remote learning or not. And it's going to change because of access to things like video conference, because of just the rate of change of technology, and frankly, structural changes because of AI, automation. The biggest employer of 18 to 55-year-old men is driving some type of a vehicle. I think that's true in most of the world. We know where all of these are going. So the people who do well are going to be the people that don't wait to be told what to learn. They're going to be the people that say, I need to plan my next 3 years out so that I am relevant. And to do that, you're going to have to pull resources. There might be resources at the schools you attend or the corporation you attend, but it also might be things that you have to have the agency to pull yourself. And so I actually think it's really important in the K-12 and university system that we encourage kids to start building this muscle of learning how to learn. In traditional models, we kind of tell kids, this is what you have to learn next. This is going to be on the test. Then the kids do it. The new model has to be, hey, let's set some goals together. Here's where you need to go. We, the educators, are here to support you, but you need to really learn how to pull that knowledge. And the students who do that well, they're going to be unstoppable. And you can imagine some of that is leveraging hybrid models. Some of that you'll be able to get in your in-person physical setting, but some of it you could get from Khan Academy, you can get from MOOCs, you can get from other resources.
Thank you so much, Sal Khan. Super exciting and illuminating conversation. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you all for joining us for another event that made us all smarter faster, this time on the future of education. I want to thank our sponsor, Facebook, for helping make today's event possible. To sign up for our latest Axios newsletter called Axios What's Next, which dives into the future trends changing the way we live, work, and play, visit axios.com/newsletters. We'll see you all at our next virtual event. And until then, follow the latest breaking news on axios.com.